prelude to the war. While a divided China was fighting amongst themselves, Chiang Kai-shek's northern expedition moved to take over Manchuria. This worried the Japanese, who had their eyes on this territory. Japan's military, against the emperor's wishes, assassinated Jiang Zuolin. Prior to this, Japan was a nation struggling economically due to the Great Depression and America's Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which crushed Japanese efforts. All of this prompted the Japanese military to invade the resource-rich land of Manchuria. Tensions with the U.S. As discussed before, the U.S. had put a lot of tariffs and sanctions on the Japanese. Furthermore, in 1924, the U.S. had installed the Japanese Exclusion Act. This was aligned with the overall Western opinion that Japanese were inferior to white people. Evidence of this can be seen as the Treaty of Versailles, where Japan's only demand was that the Japanese race be considered equal, which got accepted by most powers, except the US, who essentially vetoed it. Outbreak of the war. Japan needed more territory in Asia and hated the US. They wanted to quickly take over Southeast Asia to cut off China's supply route from the West, as well as obtain the West's oil field. Sanctions from the US after the takeover of Indochina convinced the Japanese to go to war with the US. On December 7th, they did a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to cripple the US Navy so they could take over East Asia without worrying about the US's Navy interfering in their conquests. Beginning of the war with the USA. The attack on Pearl Harbor destroyed 20 ships and around 300 airplanes. Thankfully for the Americans, all aircraft carriers were away from the base during the attack, so the American Navy was not crippled as much as the Japanese had hoped. After the attack, Singapore and the Philippines were taken. Burma was also taken, as it was the last Allied weapon funneling point for China, despite China's best forces defending it. Thailand became an ally of Japan, and finally, the Dutch East Indies were completely overrun, and Japan had claimed victory in the Pacific for the time being. The island hopping strategy and the American counteroffensive. America was sending airplanes to China via the island of Midway as an origin point. Japan sent over its navy to take over the island, and after being tricked by the Americans, Japan was ambushed and lost 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 248 aircrafts, and 3,000 were killed. American losses were minimal, losing 1 aircraft carrier with 300 killed. This battle is significant because it allowed the Americans to begin their island hopping strategy, which was a process of taking over islands with the weakest defenses while installing airstrips on them to assist in the invasion of other weaker defended islands. Over time, the Japanese situation in the Pacific would only deteriorate, as Japan would have to send more and more troops from China to defend against the Americans. The end of the war. After losing on most fronts, the Japan had lost the Philippines and many home islands to the Americans. The British also pushed them back from Burma, and the Chinese army was now mostly equipped with modern equipment. In a last-ditch effort, Japan had a final offensive into southern China that was promptly pushed back. The Soviets had also just finished dismantling Germany and had 1.6 million troops on the Manchurian border. Japan's entire front was collapsing, and with 2 million American troops getting ready to make a landing, they still refused to give up. After 2 atomic bombs in preparation for the landing, Japan surrendered to the Allies, marking the end of World War II.